Welcome to Nazarene Theological Seminary. My name is Jason Veach. I'm the Director of Outreach here, and we're so grateful to have you on our campus and in the JB Memorial Chapel, which, as you can see, is also used on Sundays by St. Aidan's Anglican Church, and we're grateful to have a space that we can extend in ministry to our community and neighborhood that's multi-use in many ways. So we're grateful to have you on our campus today for Youth on the Brain for this conversation. We're also excited to partner with YouthFront to have this vital conversation on the intersection of faith and ministry and neuroscience and the faith and science in general. And our hope today is that your hearts are stirred, that your minds are stimulated, and that you walk away from this event excited and further equipped for the context in which you are serving people. So at that, I want to introduce Mike King. He's going to talk more about YouthFront and then introduce our panel, and we'll begin our session today. So again, thank you.
Yes. So I'm not going to say much about YouthFront. Many of you know about YouthFront. We just love to bring youth workers together, people engaged in ministry, pastoral ministry, to talk about what it looks like to understand better the culture and the people we're ministering with. And so we love these days. This is a highlight for us. Especially exciting for me to once again converge my two worlds that mean a lot to me. Having the opportunity to be an adjunct professor here at Nazarene Theological Seminary, a graduate of the seminary here. Just love this place for the academic stimulation that it provided for me, but also the spiritual formation. Really getting deeply engaged in Christian history and thought, and forced to read the source documents and the earliest writings of Christians, and just a better understanding of what classic Christianity is about and Christian formation. And somebody who's been an incredible mentor to me is Dr. Dean Blevins here, and I'm also really, really grateful that he is also on the board of YouthFront. So we kind of conspire all the time about how to cooperate with God's mission in the world. And so this is a fun day. We've been talking about doing something like this for some time, but we're really excited today to have Dr. Root with us, Dr. Kim, Dr. Couts, and Dr. Dean Blevins, who's going to do the formal introduction because there are words in their titles and words in their bios that I can't even pronounce. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blevins, and thank you so much for being with us here. Let's learn together, and would it be all right if I just pray? So Lord, I just thank you for the opportunity to be here today with these your servants who have studied and put the discipline and the spiritual disciplines into learning in this area, to share with us youth workers and children's workers and pastors, educators today, how we can better understand what is going on in adolescent development and brain development. Lord, I pray that we would have open minds and open hearts today, that we would have a posture of learning, and I just pray that you would bless each one of these that are a part of this panel. Lord, we commit this to you, this time to you, that you would be glorified. We pray this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, who reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Thanks, Mike. Mike and I tend to hang out together quite a bit. Since I'm from the Southeast, it's just two Bubbas who get together to talk about youth ministry on a pretty regular basis. And so it's a real honor to have YouthFront co-sponsor this with Nazarene Theological Seminary. Before I do introductions, I'm kind of curious, looking around the room, this is a good-looking group. From my end, we ought to have a reverse angle selfie showing. I am kind of curious, since this title, Youth on the Brain, implies youth ministry, but I'm wondering who's here. Primarily your primary focus is youth ministry, and you're here to kind of think about neuroscience and how it affects youth and affects ministry. Just raise your hands. Okay. I'm also curious how many of you are lead pastors, and there's just this topic of neuroscience and the way it's going to intersect with ministry has interest in you from your standpoint. Okay. And how many of you are parents going just, oh, help me, Jesus, help me figure out how these kids work? Do I have hands raised here? Okay, all right. The reason I start that way is I think there are varied reasons for coming into this conversation. And a lot of what we're going to do in the two panels are one, to kind of talk about it specifically with youth ministry in mind, but also talk a little bit more broadly, particularly in the second session, about even the role of science and how that is affecting the way we think about ministry and the place of that. So I hope you hear it's a little bit of a both and in what we do. A little more background on me. I basically am professor of practical theology and Christian discipleship here at NTS, which is sort of like most youth ministers. That means all other duties as assigned, in a way in which I kind of engage in a lot of interest. And so this journey for me has been about a 10 to 15 year journey, sort of compensating for the things that weren't a part of my doctoral studies prior to that. And if you're curious, I can point you to writings on that. But I'm really thankful for who we have on the panel as well. And so Dr. Say Kim is the assistant director for an organization called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, and she's an epigeneticist in her own research work, and so she brings that kind of research background to what we'll be talking about. And then beside her is Dr. LeeAnn Couts, who's now the chair of Natural and Social Sciences at Mount Vernon Nazarene University, and actually has been a working neuroscientist in the past in behavioral neuroscience. Have I got that right? Okay. And just so you know, Dr. Kim is here in part looking forward to some of the other work that we are going to be doing at the seminary, and is co-sponsoring this conference this morning alongside actually some research grant money that I received through Dr. Andy Rood. And LeeAnn actually was a part of a series of interviews we did for an online version of this same topic just prior to this conference. So this has been kind of a work in progress here. And Dr. Andy Rood, Andy, I'm not sure, professor of practical theology, but also in youth ministry, prolific author in some ways. And I would say for today particularly, Andy supervised a grant at Luther Seminary through Templeton Foundation that looked at science and youth ministry, to which actually I was fortunate to get a grant, a small grant, that helps fund this. And so I'm really thankful for Andy being here today. And what we're going to do to start out is probably the three of us, myself, Say, and LeeAnn, are going to have very short sort of presentations, kind of thinking about the intersection of neuroscience and ministry, or youth ministry in general. And then Andy's going to moderate from that point forward, both asking questions, particularly with ministry in mind for each of us, but then turning it over to allow you to also ask questions as we go forward. So I hope that works. So there'll be some upfront content, and then hopefully a chance to just process this together as a group, both here on the panel. And Andy's gifted of not asking embarrassing questions. There, be praying for that one. And as well, then hopefully open it up for you to ask some questions. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do a second session after that. So that gives you kind of a feel. For professors, using PowerPoint, if nothing else, keeps us from rabbit trails. I hope you hear that. But I'm also deeply aware of what we call PowerPoint think, which means that, I hope I remember what my next slide looks like as we're going along. So I'm going to buy a vowel at times. Did want to, again, just to reiterate one thing that Jason mentioned. This space is where NTS gathers for worship on a regular basis, but we also have opened this space up to other churches in our community that's been a part of sort of the posture of NTS, that we really want to be not merely just an isolated seminary, but we want to begin to think of different ways to reach our community. And this conversation today is just another example of that. St. Aidan was gracious enough in some ways to allow us to reoccupy this space this morning, and we asked them not to move a lot of what they use as a part of their worship. I was kind of joking yesterday that brain scans and icons could have been a subtitle for what we were doing today, but we fortunately didn't put that on the screen, to say the least. Well, let me talk a little bit about neuroscience in general, and you go, why get involved in this? I've already said this has been about I'd say 10 to 12 year journey for me. I was actually had a member of my Sunday school class when I was here as a student. No, that was not the 1920s. I was a second career guy, and who was actually working at the University of Kansas in neuroscience. And I was teaching, of all things, a Sunday school class, and he kept asking crazy questions about, so how does that fit with what I'm doing in my research? I was fortunate enough to kind of put him off and then go on to my doctoral studies and kind of think, oh, I've got that behind me, and guess what? 20 years later, it's right back in my lap again. And so this has been a journey, and particularly with youth ministry. We've been active at the National Youth Workers Convention and other places presenting on this. But just to name it for what it is, if you haven't been engaged in reading about sort of neuroscience in youth, then you're late in the conversation. This has been a really growing field, and it includes sort of technical books like Linda Spear's book, The Behavioral Neuroscience of Adolescence, and that is one of those books that has lots of terminology in it, and so not for devotional reading. You really have to kind of work at it. But frankly, there have been a lot of other books that are already out there that parents of the very youth you're doing ministry with, or adults, if you're a pastor here, or if you're a parent, that you need to buy, that are already exploring the relationship between the growing research in neuroscience and the way that helps us better understand who youth are. And so whether it's Parenting the Teenage Brain, or Dan Siegel's work, Brainstorm, or Francis Jensen's work, The Teenage Brain, all of these are very popular texts. The one in the middle, Blame My Brain, is a version that's actually out of England that's in its second production. So this is not just a USA phenomenon. Different people are sort of engaging this work. I do include, there has been some work, but in some ways youth ministry is a little bit behind in this area. I think Mark Ostreicher did a book on The Parent's Guide to Understanding the Teenage Brain, and that's about, other than work that's been done in journals or magazines, that's about it inside this field. So we as youth ministers have a lot of work to do, sort of catching up in this field, that actually sometimes both the youth and the adults around us may have more of a general introduction than we do. And I think that's one reason why we wanted to have these sessions. It's also happening with children as well. And I mention that only because this means that the very parents who are engaging in reading books like The Whole Brain Child or Mind in the Making, they're already in this conversation reading about neuroscience insights and how that's fitting into general understanding of their children. And so they're going to be bringing those kinds of questions to us as ministers. So in some ways, my own sense of self-defense may equally be important for youth pastors as you think about how you understand how this whole body of sort of popular expressions of the literature affect how we think about youth ministry going forward. I hope that's helpful. If nothing else, it means that you get to increase your reading list before time is all said and done. So what does this mean? Well, in some ways, there's a kind of shift in perspective. We've always wondered about the teenager's brain. And if you look at the slide on your right, sort of the ideas in which in sort of popular psychology or popular ways we've talked about adolescence, we've always wondered what is going on inside these youth's heads. And so whether it's the birds and the bees lobe or the rebellion center or memory for music, these kind of fun ways of talking about adolescence, there's been a kind of both what I call disciplined psychology and a kind of folk psychology always going on in the way we talk about adolescence, what I call the just so descriptions of adolescence. My famous one is aliens have taken the brain kind of mindset, but we've always wrestled, and psychology is still a part of this conversation. In some ways, the neuroscience is providing us with a kind of correlation. We're now beginning to find out exactly where, geographically in the brain, or in how the brain operates, we're seeing a correlation between the neural activity in the brain and observed behavior in the way in which that's affecting. And I hope you hear the language of correlation. So thanks to a lot of research, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, we're beginning to understand that, yeah, there are parts of the brain that do indeed fire. They are activated with certain types of activities. And we're also exploring causation. I'm going to use that one carefully so that once we know this, can we develop theories out of this that helps us then adopt good practice, good ministry practices, now that we know how the brain is working. Moving from correlation, where we're finding it in the brain, to causation, then what should we do, is a kind of more tenuous task that I think scientists will hold our feet to the fire in ministry in what that looks like. But I hope that's helpful in kind of opening up the way we do it. A little bit more sort of generally, thanks to the work of both fMRIs and big machines, but also computer technology, we're getting some really incredible imagery of how the brain is portrayed to us, and we'll probably see some of this today. But we're also finding it's a pretty daunting geography. What I mean by that is that for those of us who aren't a part of the neuroscience world, terminology that you run into sometimes can be pretty tough. And frankly, when I'm reading that work as a minister as well as a theologian, I feel a whole lot more like, the image of Homer Simpson. My brain's just way too small to kind of handle all this material. Part of that's because the way the brain was mapped by neuroscientists from the very beginning uses terminology that's really different than a lot of other types of ways in which we use terminology, even talking about the body. But those of you who suffered through anatomy classes as part of your education at some point, it's the same experience when we think about the brain. And so we get wonderful pictures, but then when you look for the roadmaps of, so what is the anterior singular cortex, or what is the pons, or where is the prefrontal cortex? I mean, what does that look like, and where is that located? And is it rostral or caudal, or dorsal or ventricle? The kind of ways you navigate inside the brain, it is going to take some time to kind of get used to that type of language as you read as we go forward. I hope that makes sense. And in a way, we don't have to get too bogged down in that, but it is helpful to understand that that's a part of what neuroscientists are trying to do, is they're locating these activities. Well, just a couple more things and I'll pass it along. The other thing is that, and I think this is one place neuroscience is really helping us, is that we're beginning to understand the kind of dramatic changes that occur at a very micro level as well as at macro levels. I mean, in one way, science has really gone a long way in understanding, what I would call the microscopic understanding of how the brain is at work. Kind of a working handle, if it helps you, is when you think about brain cells, what we call neurons, that the typical adult brain has 100 billion, approximately, neurons at work. Now, that doesn't even include the connections between the neurons, the things we call synapses, where actually the information is exchanged. But one way I often will say to my students here is that we have as many neurons in our brains as there are stars in our galaxy. And I hope you hear that is a phenomenal reality and how we think about that and how they connect to each other. So even at the most microscopic level, we're discovering things about how neurons work, not just in the brain, but across the body. And one thing I'll stress is that it's not just a brain in a vat, it's not a brain on a stick. We are embodied nervous systems. And so it's about what sometimes psychologists will call a situated cognition or embodied cognition, so that the brain is also a part of the whole of the body, and that we can be fascinated by how we understand how that's beginning to work. But we do have, in some ways, regions of the brain that do play a particular role And the other way you can think about how the brain works is more like circuitry. One of the things that I think neuroscience is helping us understand is it's not just a geographic region in the brain, but it's how the whole brain works together. And one neuroscientist I like, Warren Brown, says it's probably better to think about the brain as a series of circuits and wiring that fire collectively, and then certain parts of the brain are like switching stations. And so we see more activity there, but it's not like the rest of the brain has shut off. It's that really the whole brain is at work. And that's fascinating, that even from the most microscopic to its larger components, that's really important. And I'll add one other piece, and it also includes brains to brains. And what I mean by that is our social relationships to each other. So again, it's not just the micromanagement. It is the fact that we are social creatures and that all of that is a part of what goes on in the way in which our minds and how brains are understood and affected with each other. So what are the big questions for youth and ministry? And this is kind of a framing introduction. There have been some kind of key questions that have come out that were, many of them were already there, but that neuroscience is trying to help provide some answers to, at least better evidence based on research in the brain than just anecdotal ideas that happen sometimes based on observation in ministry. And I hope you hear that difference. I mean, all of us engage youth. We have working theories of how youth behave, but it's another thing for then the neuroscientists come along and help us better understand what really is happening and how we do that. So the questions include, one of the biggest ones is, how do we understand youth as an expanding age level? One of the neuroscientists or psychologists I read a lot, Lawrence Steinberg, has just noted that adolescence has become the longest decade. And what does it mean that when I first was, the world I was born into, frankly, adolescence was more of a transition, period of transition, instead of a stage. And in those days, the social expectations was that you may or may not graduate from high school, you might go to college or enter into a job, you might marry young or not, and you now are an adult based on certain assumptions about adult roles. And so what we would call youth in those days was much more of a transitionary stage than a stage that might have multiple transitions. Today, in the literature, what we would call traditionally youth or adolescence may run anywhere from 10 years to 15 years to, in some theorists, if you think about emerging adulthood, the way the social roles are sort of implied in that, might run almost 20 years. And what does it mean to start thinking about youth as actually a longer stage than even childhood itself? That's an interesting thing to kind of wrestle with. Now, part of this is about puberty, but it's more than that. It does begin to ask questions about what are the developmental tasks and the abilities that youth have. What do we expect of youth in their own growth and development, but also what do youth bring to the bigger developmental journey? And it raises questions about how both our understanding of youth impacts the way we understand health or education, or even how culture name youth as a result of that. And there are times when neuroscientists, as they begin to understand what's going on during this period, helps us to ask whether or not are those questions biological, are they cultural, or are they both? And so one place that we need to think about that is around this idea of what do we mean by youth? And where does that fit within just our general understanding of the developmental journey? We won't spend a lot of time on that, though we might allude to that. Another big question is, how do the thinking and emotional capacities interact in youth? Sort of what are their cognitive abilities? What are they really capable of doing? And also, how important are emotions in youth? Now, I'm not talking about hormones. I am talking my generation more. But what is it about emotions as a kind of regulatory feature inside who we are, inside the brain? And I hope you hear that understanding that a lot of research is now beginning to tell us that our not sort of the way we tend to think of emotions as happy or sad, but the way our attentiveness is actually driven by our affective orientation really impacts a lot of what we learn or not as a result of that. But how do we understand the old language, head and heart together, particularly with youth in mind? What are the role of social relationships, friends, peers? That's always been a question we've asked in youth ministry, but also parents going forward. And what about risk-taking? My classic line there is every time a youth pastor says, why did he or she do that? Right? You can fill in the blank. So where'd that come from? Those are questions that I think neuroscientists are helping us think about in a positive way. There are other big questions with society and ministry in mind. One of the things now that's being discussed a lot is, in light of what we know about youth, so what are the patterns of school and social support that are best to be helpful for the sake of youth? Been a lot of discussion about when should youth go to school in light of what they need and the kind of sleep patterns. And actually, I think LeeAnn and I had a conversation about when should they be at church. I mean, is Sunday school literally too early in some of our patterns of behavior? Or could there be other kinds of patterns of meeting together that are more accommodating to where youth are? There are questions about risky behavior and long-term consequences. I think LeeAnn's going to talk more about that, so I'll just go by. But, you know, what we used to think is simple, youthful, risky kinds of behavior, are there really long-term consequences attached to that? That neuroscience has helped us understand just how profound that might be. And sort of the flip side of that, what's the difference between youthful and adult consequences, particularly in the way we see youth as being a part of the adult world? So how do we really understand youth positively and what they might contribute in leadership and creativity, and what kinds of consequences should we create space for as they learn to exercise leadership in and through our youth groups? But more, and this might affect some of you in this room, also, when is it that we're treating youth perhaps too much like adults? One of the big areas right now that might affect some people in youth ministry in this room, but not others in the same way, is basically the issue of justice and youth and the way in which they're being treated as adults as they go through the criminal process. And what are the implications of that? And one of the things I'll talk more about in the second hour is that may be a growing area that actually is bigger outside the church than it is inside the church, in the way we treat youth and what kinds of consequences they get in light of their behavior. Okay? That's a big introduction. I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to go real quick. One thing I will say, that neuroscience as a field is a growing field. Right now, primarily we know what's going on inside the brain either because of skull caps that chart electrical activity around the brain, and there's this thing called the skull that gets in the way of that process, or we put them in giant hollow tubes called fMRIs and conduct experiments where we track where the blood's moving inside the brain. And that way we know blood feeds energy, provides oxygen for energy, and so we know that part of the brain is really moving because of where the blood flow is moving inside. And then we take all that precise information and run it through computer simulations, and you get some of the really beautiful charts that you see as a result of that. But frankly, we're only at the first stage of really neuroscience research. In some ways, our view of the brain right now comes a lot closer to Christopher Columbus' view of the world instead of Google Maps. Because when you think about that microscopic level, exactly which of those neurons are connecting and why, well, we have general ideas, but we don't have that kind of specific. But I do think that's coming. There's a project going on kind of called the Connectome Project, both here in the U.S. and in Europe. It's been stalled out a little bit because of funding, but really the goal is to kind of be able to map the brain in a much, much broader way. And frankly, in some ways, again, if the brain is like the universe, there is a sort of Star Trek kind of mindset to boldly go where no one has ever gone before, and I don't care which Star Trek you're into. If you're a 1.0 like me, or if you're next generation, which is probably Gen X, or if you're actually into the new movie series, there's a lot of research left to be done that I think will be fascinating and helpful. I frankly sometimes feel less like Star Trek and a lot more like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where as I'm reading about how this research is unfolding, it's kind of, well, what's next? And it seems a little bit bizarre at times, but it's important. And so I think that's it. I hope that's helpful. Well, I think I'm going to kind of stop there with my presentation. One of the things, LeeAnn, is that okay? Okay. And then I hope you hear this was kind of why youth ministers ought to be paying attention. But I'm going to turn it over to Say, which means we're going to close out this PowerPoint, open up another one, and let Say kind of talk about how she sees this interaction working too.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Blevins. It's a real pleasure to be here and to join you in this wonderful panel. I'm delighted to be here also because my husband is a graduate of Nazarene Theological Seminary. He's right there. And so it's really nice to see his old stomping grounds. My name is Say Kim again. I represent the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the world's largest general scientific membership society. I'm also joined with my colleague, who you might have seen as you entered, Dr. John Slattery, who is back there. And so both of us are here today just to join the NTS family, so thank you. I should say that I'm both wearing my AAAS hat as well as my personal hat, so bear with me because, the world that we live in, and the bridge that we cross between science and faith. And I will reserve a lot of what I talk about for AAAS towards the second panel. So let me just start with this. I'm a scientist by training, and a lot of folks ask me often that, how did I get into science? And this is a photo of my dad, and he is after a really long hike, and he's looking at the mountains in the National Glacier Park and just reflecting on the wonder and the beauty of the mountains. John Muir, who is a naturalist and who was very influential in setting up the national park system in the US, once said, there's no synonym for God other than beauty, and describing the majesties of the mountains and the glaciers. And I think my parents kind of instilled some of that sentiment in me, and so I always cherish these kind of wondrous nature as well as learning to study it. And so that's how I got into science. And I share this picture because of another reason other than sharing a little bit about my history, is the fact that we're all a story, right? We're a combination of what we've experienced, of how we grew up. And that tells us that we're more than our biology, that we're more than the genes that make up who we are, and more than our cells. And so that's what I want to tell you about today, is how we remember things and how we know that what our story is. And so since we're looking at the brain today, memory is defined as a process of recalling what has been learned and retained. And we know we learned something when there is a change in an outcome. So whether that change is a cellular change in our body or whether that's a change in our behavior, we know that we've learned something because there is something different about how we act or what we do. And this is true, it turns out, for a lot of our cell types, not only just our neurons in our brain, which I'm going to talk about. But I just wanted to kind of, as you guys, many of you guys are working with youth, again, this idea that how they remember who they are, the idea of how they define their identity is what they remember about how they grew up. And so keep that in the back of your mind as we go through. So again, memory is a combination of our biology and our experiences. So our biology entails everything from our DNA, our genetic sequences, to all different cell types in our body, including the neuron that you see at the blue with the lots of arms and things like that, as well as how we grew up. Our parents, who we choose to, how we worship, what we eat, what we study, and all those things kind of combine to make up who we are. And the interesting thing is it's not just a one-time combination, that there's a feedback, right? So we experience something and it interacts with our biology, it makes us, and then that us makes a certain decision that kind of feeds back into certain decisions, and then it goes again and again. And so this idea that it changes our behavior, interacts with our biology will be a common theme. So if you want the funner version of this talk, watch this movie. Disclaimer, no funds received from Disney and things like that. It does a really good job, I think, from a very scientific way of illustrating how memory is formed. And it also does a really good job of how teenagers act and behave and how memory is formed in that sense, and how the brain transitions in memory. And so, again, it's a much funner version. But going with me a little bit more on a biological version, long-term memory is stored in a region of the brain called the hippocampus. So when we experience something new, we keep it as a short-term memory for a little bit. And if we need to store it longer, we convert it to what is called long-term memory, which is stored in the hippocampus. Dr. Couts will talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea is that if you wanted ice cream, and you go to the grocery store and you ask the clerk, where is ice cream? And the clerk says it's in aisle number whatever. And you go to that aisle, you'll soon forget the number of that aisle, because once you see all this wonderful ice cream, and you pick ice cream, and we'll say chocolate because I like chocolate, and you pick chocolate, you take it home and you eat it. Now you'll remember that you like chocolate. You like that chocolate brand ice cream. So you know to go back and get it next time. But you won't most of us won't remember the exact number of the aisle, right? And so that's because the aisle number is a short-term memory. You only needed it for a short time, whereas the chocolate ice cream is really important. You've got to know what you want. If we dive in, and I loved what, Dean, you said about micro and macro, because I get the sense I'm going to talk a little bit more about micro, and LeeAnn, you're going to talk a little bit more about why it matters, this bigger scale. So I'm going to take you through the journey in a micro sense and then come back out a little. So bear with me. So brain is composed of lots and lots of neurons. Yes, there's 100 billion neurons. That doesn't count all the support cells in the brain. And so it's composed of these cells. And neurons are quite special because they can conduct electricity. And they're also very oddly shaped, like no other cells. And so they have these long structures called axons, and they connect to other neurons through junctions of what's called synapses. And when we remember something or when we experience something new, it happens biologically, or it's encoded biologically, because these axons from one neuron strengthens connections to another specific neuron, and it gets stronger and stronger to reinforce that memory. So if I like chocolate ice cream, I have chocolate neurons that make stronger connections that fire every time I like chocolate. So that's my chocolate neurons, and it remembers that I like that. Scientists call this phenomenon neurons that fire together, wired together. There's a quote by neuroanatomist Donald Hebb. And so you can imagine that if we forget the idea, if we forget that specific memory, that connection becomes weaker and weaker. And then that memory is lost, and that's how memory is formed or lost. And you can also imagine with 100 billion neurons, and I think the number of stars, galaxies, the lower end, it's actually really shows you how much complexity there are in both our brain and in the universe. But if you can imagine 100 billion neurons and you do exponential connections, I mean, it's phenomenal how complex there is in our brain. So if you dive in, again, we're diving in. If you dive in, neurons are able to do this because every cell, similar to neurons, have a nucleus. Nucleus are these envelopes inside every cell that contain our genomic sequences. And so this is an artist's depiction of the nucleus. But in our cell, as well as the neurons, the DNA or the genetic sequence that encodes who we are in every single cell. And it's kind of jam-packed. And they say that if you unravel in one cell, the DNA sequence, it averages about 6 feet, one cell, 6 feet. So it's really tightly packed, and it's really, really small. And so it encodes all that we are, and it's identical in all our cells, but there's different cell types. And what makes that happen is what is phenomenal called epigenetics. So you've never thought that you would use Greek outside of your seminary Greek classes, but here we go. Epi means on top of or in addition to. I've never taken Greek. That's all I know. So it's this idea that there's something more than the DNA sequence making up our genetic code. And it's that there are these what's called epigenetic markers. These are molecular markers that sit basically on top of our DNA sequences that act as a light switch, but like a dimmer. So it doesn't just turn off our genes and turn on our genes. It dims it in a very modulating kind of a nuanced way. And in putting it back into the context of the neuron, what ends up happening is if we learn something new, so if I like chocolate ice cream, that chocolate, the neuron of that chocolate neuron, the nucleus, there are epigenetic markers that happen to turn on certain genes that strengthen the arms, the axons, and the connections of the chocolate neuron, and therefore it reinforces that connection. And so this happens on multiple scales, this happens on lots of different memories, but the idea is this, that epigenetics translate our experiences and the decisions we make in our environment into a cellular mechanism, into a mechanism on which genes can turn off and which genes can turn off. So it's really a translator between the two. And so just running, and we're zooming back out again, so I'm gonna run it through. Let's say that we experience something, we learn something, or we make a decision about our environment. It creates environmental and biological cues in our body. And these cues are easily said to be epigenetic, and they turn on certain genes or turn off certain genes as it needs to, and it creates a genetic recipe. Some of these genetic recipe results in physiological changes in cells like neurons. Some connections are stronger, some connections are weaker, and it results in a behavioral change where we remember it, and then this feedback loop happens again, right? It turns out neurons, as special as they are not that special. This happens in all our cellular biology, in every single cell of our body, because every cell has a nucleus, and they have, or most cells have a nucleus, and they have epigenetics. And it turns out, because of that, epigenetics can connect our genes and our environment in many different health conditions. And it helps encode things like development, but it also is involved in aging. It's involved in cancer, and sometimes causing cancer, but also therapies. How we respond to cancer drugs is very much a genetic phenomenon. Neurodegenerative disorders, like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or the autism spectrum disorders, and even general other health conditions like diabetes or cardiovascular diseases also have an impact. And even gut microbiome. It turns out that our bacteria in our gut affect our epigenetics and affect our behavior. So it's not me that wants the chocolate ice cream, it's my bacteria. Just saying. There's 3 important points I want to kind of emphasize just for you to take home today as you do your ministry. The first is the idea that epigenetics tells us that environment and choices matter. If we make the choices for eating an apple, exercising, sleeping, which is actually quite important for encoding short-term to long-term memory, they do involve changes in the epigenetics or epigenome, affecting genes and our cells and our health outcome. If we make not so great choices like chocolate, lots of chocolate, or donuts, or smoking, or any of those kind of things, or even trauma, or even environments that we grew up in, whether they're good or bad, they do result in another epigenetic changes that turn on other genes and can result in a different health outcome. So our environments matter, and particularly for youth and development, they're more susceptible to this because they're growing and their brain's still maturing. Secondly, epigenetics tells us that some of those experiences may be heritable to the next generation. And this has to be taken with a grain of salt, but it turns out, particularly in animals, which we use often as model systems for humans, that we see this. So if they have shown that if you take rats and you train them to fear a certain smell that they normally would like, but they're trained to fear that smell, and you would expect that they remember it because their neurons change and then they learn to avoid that smell. So it kind of makes sense that they learn to do that. It turns out that if their this rat's pups and pups, like grandpups, also have the similar neuronal changes in epigenetics, and changes in learning to avoid that smell. Think about that for a minute. What they learned, their grandfather learned, without a previous introduction, their grandchildren know. And so we see this in worms, we see this in smaller mouse systems as well. Now it needs to be taken with a grain of salt to be translated into humans, but it kind of makes sense, right? Because in humans, moms, what they do while the baby's in the womb impact the baby and the health outcome of that baby. But there are preliminary studies to suggest that youth, in European studies, youth boys who've encountered some difficulties or they made some unwise health choices, their grandchildren or grandsons have other health outcomes in comparison to those who have not had the grandparents had not had those same exposure. And so this is not a genetic mutation. This is an epigenetic phenomenon. Their DNA is fine, but it does have some outcomes. And so it brings up some important questions about youth and during their development. And the idea that what we choose to do doesn't necessarily only impact us. It impacts our children and even our children's children. The third point is that there is hope. Science and epigenetics tells us that things can change over time and things are reversible. So even though that wrong choices or bad decisions and wrong health outcomes, there are ways that if you start making the right choices and eating right, it does change and it is reversible in many, many ways. And in addition to that, neuroscience, I think, particularly shows us that the brain is more plastic than we thought. It can change, it can recover, other parts can take over function. So it's quite amazing, and the idea of recovery and the idea of plasticity, as they say. So again, biological memory is environmentally dependent. It may span generations, and it could be reversible. And I want to conclude some questions that might be relevant to our audience, and they're questions of identity, questions of who we are, how do we know who we are, that we're more than our biology. And Dean touched upon this, how do they experience the world? Could some decisions have lasting impacts? I think LeeAnn will talk a little bit about that. And how do we encourage the right choices and make a positive environment? And how do we help them be more resilient? So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I second saying I appreciate the invitation to come and spend really the day at NTS. I'm looking forward to this whole day. As Dean said, my training is in a field called behavioral neuroscience. It's a field that bridges psychology and neuroscience. So we look at the neurological basis of behavior, both normal and pathological. So very interested in trying to understand what's going on in the brain and mental illness and things like that. I don't specifically work with adolescents, although we could say that's a form of mental illness, but no, I'm kidding. How I got into this, I went to college wanting to be a clinical psychologist. I was fascinated with human behavior, and I just knew I loved people, I wanted to help people. And so I went to school, I got into a clinical lab, and even got into a physiological psych lab as well, doing research, and I learned more about myself. I learned, while I love people, I don't really like them very much. And I'm half joking. It wasn't where I was gifted, let's put it that way. And I found the rats in the behavioral neuroscience lab to be just better, predictable, and it turns out they bite less than people too. And so again, it was kind of a journey to get into that field, but it was really where I kind of found my home. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of my thinking about these things. Dean asked me to talk about a couple of challenges with adolescents, and of course, for me, the first things that pop into my head have to do with mental health. And so that's where I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And I don't know if I'm going to share anything new with you that you don't already know. But I'm going to start by just talking a little bit in general about the development that's happening in the adolescent brain. We typically talk about two main systems, a socio-emotional network that's very sensitive to social and emotional stimuli on a very basic level, a quick to respond level Neuroscientists call this the limbic system. So it's a group of different brain areas that collectively are doing this. And obviously, this is a system that's very much involved in learning and memory and motivation, as Say talked about. We also then think about a higher level system that I'm going to call cognitive control network. So a group of areas primarily involving parts of the prefrontal cortex, which is really the highest level of the brain, the most complex level of the brain. And this is going to regulate a slower, much more complex reasoning, so more rational, more long-term goals, more consideration of consequences and things like that. Not surprising, when we look at the development here, if you've worked with adolescents, you know this intuitively, that socio-emotional network is going to come online very strongly early in adolescence when the individual is going through puberty. The cognitive control network is also developing during that time, but it's going to mature much more slowly. And it's really going to extend into early adulthood. As Dean said, the estimates are it's still developing in upwards of ages 25, for instance. And so we kind of have this mismatch between these two systems that is really going to kind of be dictating what the behavior looks at any given age. So if I can kind of outline how these things are interacting and lay it out a little more specifically, if you look on your left, it's going to be the typical adolescent brain, or how we think the typical adolescent brain is working. We have these components of the limbic system, the amygdala, which is setting a heavy emotional intensity to stimuli that the individual is encountering. We have the hippocampus, as Say mentioned, that's going to be heavily involved in memory formation and providing a context, so interpreting what environment the individual is in. These are all interacting with part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. That is kind of the interface between motivation and response. It's heavily involved in reward. So as the individual is experiencing things, it's going to these areas of the limbic system are all interacting to say, with the chocolate example, to say, ooh, we got chocolate in that aisle. We're going to remember where that aisle is. And again, the cues in the store are going to be driving the person to that particular aisle that has chocolate ice cream. And again, we have the prefrontal cortex is going to be kind of we talk about it regulating executive functions. So you can kind of think of it as the CEO of the brain. It knows what's going on in all the other areas, and it's going to feed back to control the other areas. And again, that's going to be based on really rational thought, more long-term control of not regulating an in the moment, but more long-term. So in an adult, the prefrontal cortex is going to come on more fully. Excuse me. So if, for instance, you work with somebody that you just can't stand, and maybe you walk into the office and you see that person and you just kind of go, oh, I want to punch that person. And I know you guys don't. You're ministers. You don't feel that. But let's say that feeling of I want to punch that person is coming from your limbic system. That's really an amygdala-driven sort of response. But as adults with the functioning prefrontal cortex, you say, probably shouldn't do that. Might lose my job. Probably need to think more long-term about what the consequences are. And so again, we've kind of got that parent area feeding back to regulate things. Well, in adolescence, they don't have as much of that, or at least that's slowly coming online. So they're not as good at saying, I shouldn't react to that. I shouldn't punch that person that I'm feeling emotionally really driven to punch. And so again, this is really what's going to play into why they participate in so many risky behaviors. They can even tell you the long-term consequences of things because they are really making gains in their learning and memory systems and in some of those more abstract areas, but they can't fully appreciate those consequences. So you can have a teenager, and they still have some gaps in their thinking. So you can have a teenager that can tell you why drinking and driving is bad and turn right around and go drink and drive, right? that's because that prefrontal hasn't come on board. Okay, so this imbalance between those two systems is driving things like impulsive behavior, risk-taking behavior, and because they're being really heavily influenced by the socio-emotional system, it's no surprise they are very, very socially oriented, and particularly with peers, right? And so again, this sets them up for behaviors we wouldn't necessarily want them to engage in. But at the same time, that prefrontal cortex is developing, and so these are individuals who are becoming much more independent. They're looking much more adult-like, and they're demanding much more independence, even if they're not being given it, but we're more likely to give them a lot of independence and less supervision, which puts them in a really bad place, right? So they're kind of off to make bad decisions, and we're not paying attention to them. And so again, it sets them up for a lot of what I see is the real vulnerability happening there. And the one that I would first come to has to do with experimentation with drugs of abuse. And so that would be what I would say right now within our culture is the major challenge for adolescents. And I'm sure, I'm from Ohio. We lost over 4,000 people last year to lethal overdoses. I'm sure it's probably the same situation here. This is a big deal. So we don't like drug use at any age, but in adolescence, it's going to be even more dangerous. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about. We know that early onset drug use is going to be a really strong predictor of later use and even dependence. And part of that is because they're putting drugs into a system that's still developing, right? So that system hasn't gotten to where it needs to be in terms of maturity, and now we're messing around with it by putting drugs in. That's going to be bad news on several fronts. One is it's going to mean that adolescents are more likely to become dependent on drugs that they experiment with. So that's bad news. Number two is that it's going to be harder to treat their dependence. It's not easy to treat chemical dependence anyways, but it's actually harder if they started that behavior in adolescence. And three, because we are putting drugs into a system that's developing, we're more likely to see the long-term effects down the road. So even if they get into recovery, we're more likely to see individuals who are still going to be pretty impulsive. They potentially are going to have attentional deficits, have problems with long-term goal-oriented behaviors, right? So kind of seeing the big picture of things and working toward that big picture. If we look at what we think the addicted brain looks like in adults, and of course this has been most heavily studied in adults, but what we see is basically, I put the typical adult brain on the left. That's the same as what I just showed you. But what we see in the addicted brain is basically when somebody puts a drug of abuse in, the reason they're drugs of abuse is because they're going to amplify the reward pathways. So they're going to send big reward signals, and they're really going to kind of hijack that limbic system in ways that are much, much more intense than any natural sort of stimuli or natural rewards. So they're taking it over, and again, they're taking it over in a way that shouldn't be happening naturally, but that's going to create a reinforcement of these systems within that limbic system. So things are going to have intense emotional salience, so stimuli around people and places, the environment. So that in their drug seeking, their drug administration, those things are going to become really, really vivid in their lives and direct their behavior in ways that again, you wouldn't get normally. And what also happens is power or influence is going to be taken away from the prefrontal cortex. And so now you have individuals, and it's probably likely you know people that have went through this. They change in terms of their behavior to people that are going to be doing things that maybe they wouldn't do because of long-term consequences. They're now kind of ignoring those consequences and engaging in this negative behavior, right? Again, that's because of this kind of hyperactivity of the limbic system. And so hopefully what you're looking at is saying, well, that looks kind of familiar. Yeah, it looks like an exaggerated form of the adolescent brain, right? And so hopefully you're kind of seeing in adolescence, they're not mature yet, and they actually are kind of closer to hitting that addicted sort of brain system. They're a little bit closer than an adult would be who's starting that type of behavior. And so that's why they can more easily slip into that. And their prefrontal cortex hasn't had a chance to develop. We're keeping it from developing during a critical time, or what we would call a sensitive developmental time, which means they're going to have a much harder time making up for that later, which is where we're going to get the long-term effects on behavior, attention and impulsiveness and things like that. So again, kind of, it's a bad time for them to be experimenting, and our culture doesn't do them justice, I think. We set them up to fail in this way. The other thing that I'd like to talk about in a more general way is just mental illnesses. And again, you know if you work with children that this is a crucial time in development. And again, particularly because this prefrontal cortex developing, it is the highest level. So if we mess this up, there's going to be consequences at a high level. And we definitely see that. It's not surprising that about 3 out of 4 mental illnesses are diagnosed by the age of 24, which is, again, when that prefrontal cortex is developing. One example would be schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is most often diagnosed in adolescence and early adulthood. It's never diagnosed in childhood at all. It is an adolescent issue. One thing that we think might be going on is there's problems with the developmental process of what's called pruning. So what typically happens when the brain is developing in areas, you see this proliferation of the connections between the cells that say talked about the synaptic connections. There's this huge proliferation in an area that allows for a whole lot of capacity, a whole lot of flexibility. So there's a lot of potential there, and then based on the individual's experience, that gets cut down or refined, and we call that pruning, which sounds negative. It's actually a really positive thing. It kind of changes the signal-to-noise ratio of the system, and then we can focus resources on those connections that are going to be really important. So it's kind of like pruning a bush, makes that bush healthier. That's how you can look at it. Well, we think in schizophrenia, there's issues with that pruning. That pruning process goes awry, and it's going to cause a certain amount of chaos within the system, so to speak, to problems with that signal-to-noise ratio. Something else that's going to be a major issue, and again, you probably have experience with this if you've done much youth ministry, is depression. We know that adolescence is a really sensitive time for depression. Rates increase 6-fold during adolescence. It's a concern, right? Because some of these individuals are going to be considering suicide. And they're definitely looking at developmental changes. The areas that are looked at with depression, prefrontal cortex and amygdala, and disbalances there. So we think that this unequal balance of those two systems is going to play a role with this. We know that there's other things that are interacting here that make these things worse. And again, you could probably predict those. Stress is a major one. And adolescents are under a great deal of stress. It's different than our adult stress. A lot of it is social by nature. But even with the developing systems, there's reason to believe they're actually sensitized to stress. But we know there's going to be neurobiological consequences of that. Stress is going to be more likely to bring on mental illness and to make it more intense when they are experiencing it. Social isolation is another one that's going to negatively impact this, and any type of abuse or neglect that the individual is experiencing is going to influence this. Now, Dean told me I couldn't just stay on the negative side. I had to talk a little bit about the positives here, and there are a lot of positives. And if you work with this group, you know that. You know there's positives in terms of their creativity, these growths in divergent thinking and things like that that I hope you're taking advantage of in your churches. They're fresh in their thinking and they like doing it. But the good news is that as Say said, the brain is incredibly plastic. We talk about plastic, it's malleable. And that's the case throughout the whole lifespan. Again, you're being shaped every moment of your life. Your brain is changing. But particularly during these developmental periods, the brain is even more so. So what that means is any sorts of interventions or anything you can be doing are likely to have pretty big impacts. So that means basically we need to be spotting these things early and intercepting in ways that would be positive. Other things that, again, you probably know, but research demonstrates that providing safe, non-threatening environments is going to have really positive impact on brain development, which hopefully, I think a lot of you guys are doing that probably within your churches and within your contexts. Also providing social groups that, again, this is going to help with any isolation. Also, if they're non-drug using social groups, that's great too, because we know that the number one predictor of if an individual, an adolescent, is using drugs is whether their friends are using drugs. So, of course, we have those parents that say, my friend just hangs out with them to try to influence them. They're not using. Yeah, they are. If their friends are using, they're using. So again, this is things that I think you guys can provide. Also, maybe thinking about being intentional about helping them think about coping strategies. So ways in which they can handle some of the stress that they are experiencing, and even anything you can do to help them exercise their prefrontal cortex. So using it will strengthen its influence, right? And so we try doing these sorts of things with individuals that have chemical dependence problems. We try things like cognitive behavioral therapy, so getting them to slow down and think about their thinking, actually, and to be able to control their behavior and not have it be as reflexive. Mindfulness exercises are really trendy right now, and that's because these things basically enhance activity in the prefrontal cortex and quiet the amygdala. That's what we want. That's when you're going to have more productive sorts of behaviors happening. But anyway, you can engage them in some type of abstract thinking as well. They're gonna like it. They're gonna appreciate it. But it's gonna help them prepare for when you're not there to help them make decisions. It'll help them be less reflexive. So.
So this was 3 really engaging presentations, and I have no questions to challenge anything really. I have my questions. I think, I think my question, the questions I have are maybe just to take this deeper, maybe connect it even more. So I think you all connected it really well with what's going on, but maybe to sharpen it a little bit. Each of you in your own way did this nice contrasting between biology, and you didn't necessarily reference this, but you pointed to it as culture. And I think one of the places that a youth worker particularly feels often stuck is here's someone in their ministry, maybe a middle school kid, and it's clear there are some biological things going on. But it's also clear at the same time that they're being bombarded by kind of cultural realities. And how it even makes sense, it really appears that puberty is a biological reality, but how it gets worked out, how it gets practiced, how it gets expressed, comes through all sorts of different cultural forms. And so I guess the big question, and maybe you can split youth workers up this way, is adolescence a biological reality or is it a cultural reality? Now, I don't think it's an either or, but what's the engine? I mean, what's really driving this? And so as you think from your expertise, how do you negotiate the difference between kind of culture and biology?
I guess I can go. Again, those things are all interacting. The culture is influencing the biology and vice versa. There are bi-directional interactions there always. Yeah, I think our culture, as I mentioned, does a really poor job of supporting adolescents. If you even look like athletics, for our young children, we have all kinds of rec leagues for them, right? Every kid is in soccer or flag football or something like that. But as the individual gets older, they have to be really good at it because those rec leagues go away. And it's really bad timing for them because it's at a time when they want to be doing something away from home. And there is the biology, something I didn't talk about. Linda Spear has shown that there are some changes in terms of sensitivity of that reward system that sets them up to be really easily bored. And again, I know you guys know that. But they're looking for some type of stimulation, and our culture has nothing to give them except for doing drugs and being sexual. And so I think that we need to provide those outlets. We need to provide them with activities to do. We need to provide them with those social groups, and that is necessarily going to be positively influencing the biology, always.
Yeah, so maybe to follow up on that, because I think we would all agree with you, and then those of us who have children or work with children would also wonder, when you say that there's kind of nothing for them, we feel like there's an incredible amount of things for them. In some ways, the culture is all driven for them. But I think what you're getting at is even a lot of these activities, there's not a lot of deep connection to meaning, purpose, something that even could open one up to kind of a kind of transcendent meaning to life. And that could become a real issue. So you could have all sorts of things you're doing, but if at the end it doesn't feel like it has significant meaning to it, which is something I think that pushes youth ministry. That youth ministry can't just be another activity, another thing to stay busy, but what can be really powerful is providing young people a significant way to construct meaning.
I think you're exactly right. I think that even drives part of the chemical dependence problem in our country is that overall we have a lack of spirituality. Kent Dunnington, if you're interested in that, has a really good book. He's from Greenville College in Illinois. He has a really good book called Addiction and Virtue, really talking about even the philosophical and cultural way that we let individuals down in our culture because we have a natural need to find meaning, and there's no place to find that meaning. So people are finding it places that they shouldn't be finding it. So that, yeah, if we can provide a spiritual aspect to these individuals, and you can push them kind of hard with some complex things because they're exercising that prefrontal system, they'll like that. They'll like being pushed hard. But it will start to give them a meaning system that will satisfy some of that. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, I just wanted to add that the question of what scientists often call nature versus nurture is very much of a culture question, right? Does culture matter? And culture is part of that bigger environment that we're discussing today. The idea that culture I also wanted to include that our culture for the youth and adolescents, particularly I think on the radar, is the issue of technology. And the brain is a muscle, very much of a muscle, right? Memory, the mechanism of memory tells us everything is flexible, everything can be strengthened, or everything can be weakened. And you have to exercise that. And that includes these thoughtful spiritual exercises. It includes these spiritual practices as well, or just being able to be thoughtful in how they behave or they think. And technology sometimes doesn't make that easy, right? I mean, 141 characters, not much you can say there. I mean, people get creative, but it's very limiting, right? And so to keep in mind that in addition to the plasticity, it's an exercise. They have to remember, and we all have to use and exercise our brain, and particularly important for the youth in our cultural context.
The only thing I would add to that, I mean, in some ways it's both inward, and I'll use this language, but it's also outward in the way in which a lot of times the culture youth receive is in a commercial or commodified form. So it's there to keep them busy, not necessarily in a meaningful way, nor is it necessarily their vision of what they want to participate and do. One of the phenomenons that seems to be, ever since a documentary called The Merchants of Cool, is that every time adults, and I'll just use it this way, adults try to capture youth culture and flip it and market it back, youth tend to, over time, become resistant to that. It loses its efficacy, and I think that's because the youth themselves aren't participating in that creatively. They're not thinking about how they're participating within it. So you may have multiple activities, I mean, maybe way more than we imagine, and they may not be always meaningful, but they may also be just products from their perspective, and therefore it's not surprising they would want to sometimes do things with them that we would least expect, but that's actually the positive side of the creativity that youth can actually bring. So culture is important. In some ways, who controls that culture is, I think, a big question when it comes to youth. Is it something that they're meaningfully participating in and something that they're actually co-creating with, or are they just receiving it from somebody else? Those are questions, I think, even in youth ministry. Are we helping them be co-participants in what's going on, even in the way we think about culture in the life of the church, too?
I want to come back to that as we talk a little bit more about mental health issues maybe in a minute here. But I want to go to memory because I think it's a fascinating piece. And what you presented was really fascinating. And I had flashbacks of watching Memento in my mind. You remember the Christopher Nolan Memento movie of the guy who can't form long-term memory, right? So he has to tattoo everything on his arm, and we're just kind of caught in his lack of memory throughout the whole movie. And then also, I mean, there's the very famous case study that's almost an all neuroscience book is the Phineas Gage story of this very upstanding man. This is like railroad, late 19th century. He's working on the railroad. He's a kind of upstanding man, good, polite. Accident occurs, railroad spike goes up in the air, goes through his head, out the other side. Somehow he doesn't lose consciousness. They take it out, and his personality completely changes. Uses foul language, can't keep a job. And so this was like the first documented case that trauma to the brain can change your personality completely. And so if you go, and if you know the Christopher Nolan Memento movie, part of the deal is he's trying to avenge what he thinks is the memory of his wife who's been killed. So he's trying to figure this out. And I'm going to ruin the movie for you, but if you haven't seen it, that's your fault. This is like 10 years old. What we discover at the end is that there's a crooked police officer who's actually using his lack of memory to get him to kill other people. And so he never can actually find any, well, if we want to say reconciliation or satisfaction that this injustice has been avenged because he can't remember it. So in some ways, reconciliation, moving towards new community, something happens within our brains there. But what's fascinating about both those examples, and that I think really freaks us out, particularly as ministers, but maybe just as human beings, is that memory is deeply embedded in a moral category of what it means to live a good life, of who you are. And we do have to feel like we have some consistency with our articulation of this is me, this is who I am, my I, because of the reflex to have to be a moral agent in the world. And one of the things social scientists are saying when they look at human agency, at least a stream that I like to follow, is that people tend to make decisions out of some kind of implicit or at times explicit, but implicit sense of what is good and what everyone is trying to live in some ways a good life. Every parent is trying to do what's good for their kids. It could end up totally a bad thing to do, but they're doing it because they think it's good. So I guess the question around memory, and particularly as people are showing us slides of neurons and inside, how does this become a moral issue? And here are people who, whether they want to face it or not, are dealing in moral categories with people. And this particularly opens up to identity, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Whoa, I don't think we have time to cover all that. I will share some thoughts. The idea of what constitutes us and our consciousness and issues of morality, I think it's both a scientific question, but it's also very much of a theological and spiritual question, right? From the scientific perspective, there are studies to show that we have something in us that tells us, okay, that the idea that something is not fair or something is not right. And the very classic example is a study by Franz de Waal, who's a very well-known animal psychologist or biologist. And if you want to look up something on YouTube, this is really fun. So you have monkeys, and he gives one, they each get, I think, like a grape or something, or like something not as yummy. And he gives them to them. There's two in each cage. There's one in each cage. And then he gives one, like, I think a banana or something much more tastier. And then this one sees that this one gets like a nicer treat. And he's like, well, this is my interpretation, but he's like, that's not fair. And so he's like pegging the other one with the grapes. Because he's like, I don't want this grapes. I want what that monkey has. And so he starts pegging. So this sense of fairness, the sense of something is not right, there's some biological phenomenon to it. With that said, I think from a theological question, the questions of where is the spirit? Where is the human spirit? And I know the Bible says, that the spirit, forgive me, I'm not a theologian, but what makes the soul, our soul unique, for example, the combination of soul and body coming together and spirit, those are phenomenal theological questions that I don't think science can answer. And I will leave with two thoughts. One is that we're using our brain to study our brain, right? Right? And then the second thing is, and this I take from a scientist at Stanford, he said, if you replace each of our neurons, because we know how that happens chemically and we know how that happens mechanically. So if you replace one neuron with, let's say, a machine neuron, like we can now insert like artificial things in us to make us work. So if you were to put in an artificial neuron, would you still be you? Okay, one neuron out of 100 billion. Okay, what about 50 billion? What about, think of that sequentially, right? At what point does it make you? Are you still you? And what point are you not you, right? So this is all to say, I don't know. And it's a very important question. That's why theology and these things are really important philosophical questions.
I'll address it a little bit differently. One way to look at some of these foundational things is to look cross-culturally. And there does seem to be some moral fabric that's found in humans all over the world. So pretty much everyone agrees you should not kill somebody else, which again just kind of says that it's built into our system in some way, which again maybe is not surprising. If that we're created by God, that's not surprising that there is some foundation. I will say then that we used to think that for moral decisions, they're pretty high-level decisions, and what would happen is when they're faced with that, you reflect on it very deeply and you make this really good moral decision. What we are now finding out is that that's idealistic. We're probably not doing that. We're responding at a much more reflexive, instantaneous level, and then we're trying to rationalize our responses, right? And so you're trying to make the moral argument for why you did what you did or justify why you did what you did. And I'll say that it gets back to memory in terms of we are being shaped by our behaviors. Whether we like it or not, we are becoming the person we're making ourselves by our current behaviors. So if you have a person that engages in things like spiritual disciplines, it's shaping their decision-making process, right? If you have somebody who's studying Scripture, there's a reason we're supposed to study Scripture. You study Scripture because it will, at even an unconscious level, change the way you respond in situations, right? Devout Christians respond differently than atheists in different situations because of who they have become because of that process. So I think it speaks to the importance of us being engaged as a community in these sorts of behaviors, because it's without our knowledge or with our knowledge, either way or both ways, forming who we're going to be as decision makers and agents in the world.
Yeah, I was really also fascinated with your rat example, in passing this on generation to generation. You can almost feel like, oh, this could be a great evangelism strategy. You know, like if you just move this forward, and we can see this kind of neurological connection with it. And clearly, it seems to work with human beings, right? Jung kind of talked about how across cultures, it seems like all human beings are scared of snakes, and you learn that at a young age. It gets passed on in some way, and people have really warped views of snakes too. Like pretty much everyone culturally thinks snakes are slimy, and they're actually not, but this kind of gets passed on, and we don't know where this happens. So there's something like that. But it also seems like human beings, one of the things that's quite unique about us, maybe you can correct me on this, is that we offload a lot onto culture. Like we allow culture to hold a lot of the stories, to hold a lot of the moral codes, to hold a lot of that. Like we offload that, and it holds on to that. So I guess maybe a question for us is, we've entered into a digital age where we're offloading more and more now onto silicon, and just our parents' phone number, all of this stuff is all kind of offloaded into a cloud, a cultural cloud, or a real cloud. Does that have an effect? I mean, think of people who are trying to pass on real content of the Christian story to people. I mean, Christianity is a religious commitment that you do have to know stuff. There is stuff you have to actually know. Does that become a more difficult process when we enter into cultural practices of offloading more and more on, and so we don't know stuff, we just need our phone? And that also makes us kind of powerful, but it also makes us both smarter and stupider at the same time. Do we see neurological proof of that in some way? And what do we do about it?
I mean, there has been a lot of work done with neuroscience and the use of technology. And some of it's very cautionary tales. I mean, in some ways it's who's doing the work inside that. But I do think the idea of how we choose to participate, even with the offloading, so use your language, are we dependent upon that technology as opposed to other ways in which we've carried those memories and the stories within the community, within certain practices that we do? Yeah, it is a danger. I think the idea that the fact we possess something means we have a living memory of it is a real difference. I use your famous gauge. I think one of the big mistakes of a previous generation was that we divided thought and emotion. So we're thinking things, and emotions don't matter. And some of you know the old Bill Bright train, so fact before feeling kind of thing. And now we know, thanks to work like Antonio Damasio kind of built on the Phineas gauge, that we are as much feeling as we are thinking. They're interwoven, and we've heard that today. In some ways, I think the danger right now is that to possess an artifact through a phone, so my brain is in my smartphone, is not really true unless it is also a part of our lived experience on a regular basis. I think that's one thing we're learning from memory studies.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting reality for those of us working within the Christian tradition here, is that we've always offloaded things onto something else. I mean, that's what the Christian tradition is community after community of generation after generation offloading their most important encounters with God and their language to articulate who God is onto the tradition. The question becomes, that always becomes personified or encounter with persons, with a cloud of witnesses. It's very different when it's digital bytes on a hard drive, and how that. And so is there anything about memory that encounters with persons, encounters that become maybe narrated, that we actually encounter persons as opposed to just data, does something different to our brain?
So I think technology, when we first think about it, we're like, oh, this is all dangerous and things like that. But I think humans are quite resilient, and that's really one of the uniqueness about humanity, is that I think we're built very resilient. And the unique thing about memory is that memory, Dean mentioned earlier, was it neuroscience and icons or something like memory works with pictures and icons and triggers, right? So you associate a smell with something, or you associate a certain, that aisle with the chocolate ice cream. I keep using that example, but the circumstances, certain things trigger certain memory. When you hear music, when maybe it's a special song because it reminds you of something, a special moment. And so the idea of icons, I think, could be really helpful to help us understand technology, because we can use, similar to how we use icons to trigger memory, I think technology we can use to transcribe or store some of those stories. And in some ways, one of the examples, I think, the Christian communities, church communities, they use technology really well. I mean, just like PowerPoint or worship and things like that. And that's a sign that you can incorporate into spiritual practices in a useful way, because those are tools for us to use. So in some sense, I think we can adapt and we can use it for the good. And that's the potential of technology, and to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to go to Italy, say, in the way medieval or even earlier churches essentially used technology to do all those things. The smell, the frescoes. And so in some sense, it's really interesting, and there's no answer to this, but it's interesting to be Protestants who in some ways create the conditions of modernity to give us the kind of scientific work you do, but also on the back end hurts us because we've stripped our experiences for different theological reasons from a lot of these things, like icons, like frescoes, like scent, kind of gets stripped away. And our churches, at least in North America, sometimes some of them can feel like office complexes and not like you're entering into essentially heaven falling to earth.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, one of the things, I mean, taking out AAAS hat, but the phrase, do this in remembrance of me, and it's an actual action, right? I mean, you have to wonder why that's in there, right? Like, to remember by action and help us remember. I mean, that's a form of doing something to trigger an association and things like that. So there are elements, and even technology, I think we can use it for good of memory or remembering something.
Yeah, just a reminder again, this language of embodied cognition, I mean, that phrase sounds abstract, but it just reminds us that even when we're talking about the brain, we're talking about the totality of who we are as created beings, and that's also in relationship to other beings. And so, in a way, if technology still bridges those realities, then it has the possibility of use. But the fact that it becomes, and I'll use a word that's kind of the theological, it becomes Gnostic in its orientation, then I think that's not, where neuroscience is taken is going, that's a false understanding. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and to really put that on the road of our ministries, I mean, we often say things like, we want kids to know, we want them to know this, we want to know this, but it hasn't been a new thought. For the last few decades, we've realized that practice is really significant. So midday prayer is just as important as being able to know all these things. Like, doing those things seems to have deep neurological correlation. Yeah. But the last element I wanted to talk about off of these three great presentations was to think about mental health issues and drug use, which seems to be something those who are working with younger generations of people, maybe all people, but younger generations of people, more and more this is becoming, I think, an issue. So this is a little selfish because I just read this really great book by this French intellectual, which now you're supposed to think I'm cool, who wrote this book called The Wariness of the Self. And the whole book was actually a genealogy of depression, trying to talk about how depression got here. And he goes back to when melancholy and how these kind of anecdotes to how these kind of conversations about melancholy work. But he really makes this assertion that depression particularly is pretty much a 1970s and after phenomenon. And it has a lot to do with the hyper speed of modernity. That life picks up pace, that you have to actually construct your own identity, that you have to create your own self, that you have to continue to work this. And what depression becomes, he thinks, especially kind of the Prozac as a response to this depression, is the wariness of the self, having to do the self's project of recreating itself. So it's the exhaustion and burnout of having to figure out who you are all the time, and then feeling like all your actions to project and get the recognition for that identity hits a brick wall. And so that depression just becomes a very common reality, and it has a lot to do with this cultural sense of needing to create your own identity and the burden of creating your own identity. So you talked about stress, and I wonder about, kind of from a neuroscience perspective, the stress of at least some philosophers say modernity equals speed. Like to be in a modern world is the continuing speeding up of technology, social change, and pace of life. And this is just continued speed. And so is there a speed limit to the brain? And we've always kind of had this sense that advances in technology could destroy the brain. When the train went, they were sure that brains would explode going over 30K. And then, you go all the way to the cell phone, and we were kind of past it now, but it was only 6-7 years ago we thought our brains were going to become completely destroyed by cell technology. So there's been this movement even with the phone, that every time there's been this huge jump in the acceleration of time through technology, we thought the brain would melt. But as a scientist looking at this, and we think of mental health issues, how does the brain respond to speed? And can we equate speed and stress together?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things wrapped up into that. I think number one, it depends on the person, because we have different personalities, and some of you out there, really like the speed, you thrive on it, and others do not at all. It's overwhelming. So I think we start there for number one, to say there's individual differences. And I think this idea of how much we're asked to do, how much multitasking we're asked to do. I think younger folks don't know how to handle that, and maybe as people get older, you learn what your limits are, so you can shut yourself down if you need to, or you can step back, or how much you can handle. I think they have to learn that. But I think for the most part, biologically, the brain's kind of set up to have its own endpoints, right? So sleep, for instance, is the brain's way of restoring and doing some of that consolidation of memories and stuff like that. And so the systems are built in. When your cells are really active, they're actively using down some reserves that will get the person closer to a state of sleep. So adenosine, for instance, which is why caffeine works to keep you awake, is we're kind of blocking that. So I think left to its own accord, the brain has set points and it'll regulate itself. We're really good at overriding those, right? We're really good at monster drinks and things like that are, again, we're kind of telling the brain, you don't know what I need, and pushing forward. So, and I think we've done that in unhealthy ways, pretty much. But I think there does need to be some timeouts from things. I think there needs to be, just biblically, a Sabbath. It's there for a reason. It's there for us to recharge and restore and reflect. And so I think we have lost some of that in modernity. But just talking in the break to Pastor Ken, who said that I think his daughter had children going into counseling for depression, and the first thing that they said was, take away their phones. Take away their phones, and we'll start from there. And that helps a lot. So pulling back from some of that.
Helpful. All right, I want to, Dean, jump in, please.
Probably, and I think this is why this would be a 4-hour conversation trying to wrap up in a very small piece. So I hope you hear that. I think some of the questions you're asking are there behaviors that if we continue to engage in them, do they make us more susceptible to depression? And I think a lot of what LeeAnn was saying is very true. That I think neuroscience is sometimes, when it comes to what I would call the spirit of the age, kind of large kinds of ways in which we're thinking about representations, mental representations, actually result in absolute causation. For some neuroscientists, I think they'd be real reluctant to make that jump. They might say, in the light of the stress of this era, we're seeing certain things happen within the brains, but what's the one-to-one causality? I think most neuroscientists would be real cautious. But I'm not one of those neuroscientists. So I think even to kind of think big, with think about youth ministry, this pressure on identity, which we've inherited actually from back to Erik Erikson and other eras, where we said the single most important thing for youth to resolve is their identity, as if it was a singular, isolated, part of who they are that they could sort of come to terms completely with in a given sort of act of will or at least intellectual organization may have created some of the cultural pressure that results in that depression. In other words, if I am using my brain and the representative power in the brain and even the emotional energy that's associated with that and regulating that to try to resolve that question, and that is the single most question that I'm supposed to do as a youth. I need to know who I am by the end of my adolescent journey. Maybe that's not a fair question. I think we're now starting to ask questions like, maybe it's less who I am, but to whom do I belong? And how is, in some ways, who I am, if we still want to use that language, is also based on the giftedness of the community around me. And that's a little more, I think psychologists would even say that's a little more fluid category. And we would allow youth, maybe to give them a break, to not see this as the single issue. That reduces that stress, that causal stress, that results in depression a lot of times. And so I hope you hear, maybe it's a both andness in that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we would have to say whatever identity is, it's dialogical. It has to be in conversation. One doesn't have an identity individually. You have to have another brain in discourse. It has to be persons in discourse. And at least some of this research is saying what depression is this feeling that the live wire between you and the world is essentially dead. And there's no discourse. Nothing is talking back to you. Nature isn't talking back to you. Other people aren't talking back to you. So you feel like everything goes numb within that. And I do think religious communities, I mean, there's all sorts of things we can do and think of medication and things we can learn from the sciences. But the history of Christian thought and other religious perspectives is this deep sense that there is a world, there is a God who speaks. And there is a discourse going on. So some of these classic practices that we've used actually could be quite helpful in some of this baseline depression that goes through, I think, all of us, but particularly young people. And so it's not so much giving them a way to know. I think this is your point, Dean. It's not so much giving them like these are the things you need to, how you need to understand yourself, as much as giving them a community to practice certain things and to have experiences of what a German thinker, now you really think I'm cool, calls resonance, this deep sense of something, there's resonance within your relationships or discourses within the world.
Yeah, and actually there's a particular neuroscientist, I know, Warren Brown, who uses that same language of resonance, slightly different way. But and I think I'll mention something. This is a real stray thought, but I'll make it fast. I mean, one of the things that we talk about also in neuroscience research, particularly neuroscience's interface with education, is what we call neuromyths. And one of them was actually, this is kind of how science evolves. I don't know how many of you remember the baby Mozart phenomenon. Oh, yeah. So if you want your
spent a lot of money on baby
you want your child to be artistic, or you want your child to be intelligent, and so you did these. And when they went back and looked at the experiments, which were actually based on rats, I mean, so it was one of those fun things. What they understood is, as rats in cages, is they gave them a more rich environment, they thrived more. Well, that's because those cages began to look much more like their everyday environment, be it the back alley or other places. So the fullness of experience and expression and participation in that was more important. And I think that's something, again, thinking about youth ministry, but also thinking about Christian formation. How are we giving youth a full participatory expression of what it means to be Christian, from worship to service to other forms of gathering and community, that in some ways both alleviate sort of the isolation of depression, but also give them a different way of understanding what their memory is. It's all interwoven at that point.
Well, let's turn it to you for a few minutes. A question do you want me to move the mic around?
Hi. So one of the things I'm thinking about as you guys are talking here and how we're all in here because we love teenagers and we want to build relationships with them, and we know that those are kind of the greatest agents to change kind of people, is the idea of a social synapse. And if you guys could speak to that at all, because we know that synapses don't just happen internally, but between people in relationship, and that is kind of how we're formed and changed and kind of members of one another, even if we're not part of like the body of Christ, but that we change each other through relationship, and kind of how we're wired for that kind of connection. Without it, we can't survive. So if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Oh, sure. I think our relational nature is one of the primary ways that we're created in the image of God. And the whole basis of the nervous system is relational in nature. Down to the cells with all their processes, that they have all those processes to be in relationship with each other, and they're changed because of it. We know that we're social creatures. We attend to faces, and we're given actual brain space for attending to faces. More recently, they have looked at the mirror system. So the idea that as part of the empathy system, that when we're looking at each other, we're actually to some extent experiencing what the other person is doing based on their goals. So it helps us to determine what somebody else's goal is. But the same way, you see somebody else crying, you feel sadder because of that. So I think it is kind of like that other person is inside your brain, you're experiencing it, which I think is awesome. I kind of can't help but kind of, and it's a big jump, but jump to kind of the Trinity, that you're separate than I am, but yet you're not. You're inside my head. And so we can think of separate but same with that. So yeah, definitely we are made to be social creatures and to experience what others experience. And we do change each other. So each interaction, if it's positive or if it's negative, we're impacting the other person. So, which again, to me, says we have to take our interactions very, very seriously, because we are at a fundamental level changing that person. Did that address what you want?
A couple things just to build on that is, I think this is where neuroscience is a big umbrella inside which there are different disciplines. And so there's behavioral neuroscience and there are others. One growing field is called social neuroscience, and probably the guru right now is Dan Siegel's work in that field, if you're interested. But it is this idea that we are actually cross-wired, and so that we're wired in relationship to others. A lot has been made of mirror neurons and the empathy of that. The other thing I think is the von Economo, if I said that right, cells or spindle cells, which seem to be most cell neurons, if you think about them, tend to look either like starfish or spiders with multiple legs, or like Christmas trees. But these are really long and elongated with the center that look like a spindle, if you think about it that way. And there are neuroscientists now trying to say, is that because they tend to occur in socially minded species, human beings, but also other species that have really strong relationality. And so they're thinking, is there sort of wiring that really says we are wired for relationship? And this is really both the inner as well as the outer. For those of us in the Christian tradition, who really talk about, and I'll just say it, the Trinity is a form of relationality, and that in some ways, maybe who we are as created beings are defined first by the Imago Dei being more a relational understanding of what it means to be in relationship to God and to others. This makes absolute sense in kind of understanding it. Again, neuroscientists won't go to that point of causation. They'll talk more about correlation at that point, but I think that's an important component of what we're talking about.
Great. Do we have one more question? Yeah.
I just wonder, given that kind of social neuroscientific relatedness model, sort of an interpersonal neurobiological model, two things crash into each other all the time in my context. It's not that kids rooted in a youth group and families in our churches often aren't using drugs so much as they're using cell phones. And that's really the bigger question. What is this doing? That crashes into the the way that adults overschedule our kids and perhaps even make them then symptomatic, because some of the natural drive for relatedness that helps young brains develop now is only mediated through social media. So I just wonder what you guys think about that, how you talk to that, and how maybe we could talk specifically to parents.
I mean, there is a big body of research happening looking at the effects neurobiologically on from social media, and for the most part, it tends to look pretty negative. It is a form of social connection, but it's not as meaningful of a form of social connection as a person-to-person sort of interaction. So again, you're seeing changes, and again, more of this almost of the limbic system overdevelopment that's happening, so people are more emotional and reflexive in their responses, which they will, having the distance between individuals gives a safety net, so that many of those interactions are very negative. And again, that's going to feed back to change that system in really negative ways. They say things they would never say if the person was standing right in front of them. And so I think the story's still out, that the verdict's still out, but it's moving toward a point of looking very negative there. So yeah, I think that's going in that direction. Exactly what you would suspect.
I think I just want to reemphasize the fact that rest is very important, unplugging, and I think LeeAnn did a fantastic job explaining that. Just to give you some context biologically, in our neurons, once they fire, it needs to rest. There's a moment in period where you can't fire again along that axon, and it's because it needs to allow that signal to go through, pause, and then another signal can go through. So just understanding that even there are limits to a single neuron on how much it can fire constantly, that it needs to take a physical rest, can kind of explain on a molecular level that if you think as an organism or as an entire human being, it reinforces the idea of rest and giving yourself a break when being inundated with all these technology and information.
And Tim, the only thing I'd pick up on that, and this may be part of my pet peeve, is the performance side of what you're talking about. I think for creativity you have to be able to play, but I think when you regiment that in programmed ways that we call competitions and sports leagues, that's more performance mandated than it is playfulness. Kind of go back to LeeAnn. I'm amazed that in some ways young people nowadays, a lot of their decisions physically are foreclosed before they even hit high school. And so the idea of someone picking up a sport, let's just use that language, and playing it in high school, if you hadn't started in sports leagues when you were in elementary school, sometimes even before that, the performance mindset has already eliminated lots of options in how we embody our own creativity. And that may be different than the neuroscience question, but I do think it forecloses lots of experiences, which really does change the way the brain operates as a result of that. And my daughter, by the way, parenthetically, is a grad assistant in a strength and conditioning program, so she was a sports nut all the way through. And she'd probably say, "Dad, just shut up" at this point. But I think in some ways, having watched the way the social fabric, and I want to say more in the affluent communities, of sort of putting pressure on performance in the midst of playfulness, is something we need to back up and ask how healthy that is in light of how the brain experiences the world and how it's shaped as a result of that. So I think as youth ministers, I don't know if this is sacred ground or not for what we do, but to ask the question, where do our young people play, not on social media, but literally play, and how do we provide affordances, opportunities for that as a part of what we do, I think is really kind of important. This is not so much which games do we schedule at the beginning of the youth gathering, but are there healthy and holistic ways that youth have a chance to experience the world?
Well, that means we need to transition because we need to be done at noon because some people need to play Fortnite. So we need to a good transition. So we're going to transition to session 2, and take it away.
I just want to take a moment to kind of introduce AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and our partnership with the Nazarene Theological Seminary, and then just highlight some thoughts on just general science and society and science and faith relationship, both seen from AAAS and my own personal views. And so, again, just highlighting John and I, John back there, Dr. Sadri, and I, we are in Washington, D.C., and we work at an association called the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. It's a very old organization. I think it's one of the first or second oldest scientific associations, founded in 1848, representing about 10 million scientists worldwide. And it's an advocacy organization. It's a non-religious organization, purely focused on science advocacy. It's mostly well known as a publishing house for Science magazine, and it is one of the premier journals in the scientific field to publish your research. We do education, public advocacy, and engagement. John and I work at a program called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. It is a public engagement division within AAAS. We have a great team, a team of scientists, communications, and theology-trained staff members. And it's been around since 1995 to facilitate the conversation between religious communities, and that's all types of religion and no religion, as well as the scientific community. And it was formulated because we recognize that the public in the U.S. as well as the world is largely religious, and there are worldviews at how we see the world. And in order for science to enrich and support humanity and for society, we need to be able to engage the public. We do a number of projects, both for the scientific community, helping them to communicate better with the sciences towards the religious public or publics or their classrooms. We have programs for religion reporters, and these are journalists that report on major media outlets but cover religion, as well as bringing scientists together with pastors and clergy members to kind of dialogue about what is important about science and society issues. The project I want to highlight, portfolio projects I want to highlight, is our Science and Theological Education portfolio, which is really an initiative to partner with seminary institutions or other clergy training institutions like rabbinical schools to incorporate science into their curriculum. And our current initiative is called Science for Seminaries. It's a partnership with the Association for Theological Schools, which is an accrediting body of seminaries and seminary faculty, to create a positive cultural change about science and the broad American public. And this is because a lot of people, when they have questions about science, go to their religious leaders and not to a scientist. And because a lot of people don't know a research scientist. So there's a lot, but there's also very few in the context of the world. And so, but more importantly, when it comes to questions about science, it's really the end of life, beginning of life, important life questions about mental illness. I mean, how do you raise a family? Those kind of things that intersect with science. And so it's in recognition of that. It's a competitive proposal-driven process where we award seed grants to seminaries. And so I just want to commend Nazarene Theological Seminary, NTS, for receiving this award. I mean, it's a really big deal. And so far we've reached 17 Christian seminaries in the United States. And just to give you some context, we asked the seminaries to revise 2 seminary classes to just integrate science wherever they think is most relevant. In the case of NTS, it was neuroscience and youth because of the ongoing projects that Dean already had. And to adjust 2 classes and do 1 campus-wide event. The first phase, which included 10 seminaries, you can anticipate 2 classes, 10 seminaries, so 20 classes. It ended up being 110 classes to be touched and 1 campus event, so we expected 10, but we ended up, I think the current count is around 80, and it's growing. And so that just tells you that the amount of interest, the reason you're here, it is very relevant to your ministry, and it's very relevant to life to be supported in these things. And so, again, we commend NTS for being a part of it. We generate a lot of resources. John has brought some really amazing resources in the back, so feel free to grab them. I just want to highlight this video series, which is which we're very proud of, which I think you guys feel welcome to use it in your classrooms and church classrooms during small gatherings, as well as a seminary curriculum as a discussion guide, but this is just a highlight video.
We live in a world loaded with questions and puzzles.
The human spirit does gain a lift from pure curiosity and where we fit into the larger scheme of things.
So we get into those philosophical questions of what is life? What is it to be human?
So we have a number of different topics we've engaged on. We're continuing to make these videos. They're really discussion starters, very interesting, beautiful imagery, and a lot of the scientists are really at the forefront of their field. And so feel free to reach out to John and I if you have these links, but they're on our Science for Seminaries website. Again, just a broader perspective on science and religion in our U.S. landscape, and there's 3 points. The U.S. public is largely religious, and they're all interested in science because it touches every part of our lives. And again, I mentioned this earlier, that many people go to their religious leaders, their clergy, or their pastor when they have questions about science, which makes it all the more important why we do what we do from Dozer's perspective. When we think of the science and religion relationship, most people say it's of conflict. And this is a Pew Research study done asking the public, generally, do you think science and religion are one of conflict or compatible? And 60% in the US population say it is in conflict. Interestingly enough, when you ask them, does it conflict with your own religious beliefs? Many people say, no, it does not. And so it brings up this idea of the perception that's out there that science and religion is in conflict. And I think there are very respectable dialogues in terms of it, in some issues it can be of conflict, in some issues there's many ways to think about it, in some ways are compatible. But the more important point I wanted to get across is that it's so much more nuanced and complex than that. There's a lot of scientists who are religious themselves and practice a religion, so it's part of their daily life. So saying about 30% of US biologists and physicists are slightly or moderately religious. More importantly, why is this important for the scientific community? This is a quote from Dr. Alan Leshner, who was the previous CEO Emeritus of AAAS, and he said, science has never been more productive. A weakened science and society relationship not only undermines public support for science, but also makes it difficult for science to contribute to the solutions of societal problems. Again, going back to the idea that we want science to better humanity, medical things and our knowledge and things like that, and it doesn't work if we're not engaging the public. But on a personal note, why is science engagement important for churches? And this has been a particular interest for my husband and myself, and very well outlined in a book called You Lost Me by David Kinnaman, by the Barna Group. If you haven't read it, I encourage our youth pastors to read it. And it's asking the question why young Christians are leaving the church and rethinking it. And it's a study of 18 to 29-year-olds to ask them why they're leaving after college, because majority of them actually disconnect from the church community in their college life. And it says that there's 6 reasons. And among the 6, one of them is the perception that science and religion are in conflict, that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in, that they embrace the perception that Christianity is anti-science. And for scientists like myself, I think this is a real detriment to the church community because science itself can be a calling for many of our youth. 50% of those church-going youth are interested in STEM fields or healthcare and things like that. Only 1% of youth pastors preach or talk about science in their ministry. So if you're thinking about raising children or raising the youth to do the great things that they're supposed to do in the calling that they're called to do, but they're not encouraged in it, I think it's a real sad thing. So I just wanted to share that sentiment with you and conclude with this thought. This is from Dr. Randy Isaac, who is the past executive director, the executive director of emeritus of the American Scientific Affiliation, which is an affiliation of scientists who are Christian. So it's a network, it's a fellowship network. So I encourage you to look at that as well. But he said, As a leader of your congregation, you do not need to become an expert in science, but to ensure that scientists are welcome and that resources are available. In a world that's too often polarized, it is important to show that there are many Christians in science who have grappled with perceived conflicts and have demonstrated the underlying harmony of science and faith. So I'll leave you with that thought. Feel free to reach out. AAAS, John and I are always available should you have any questions. Thank you.
And I think this is just a short note, but we started here at the beginning. So for us at Nazarene Theological Seminary, we're in the middle of a conversation that actually began, actually thanks to Andy, but a broader conversation on science and youth ministry. And we're continuing this conversation now on the Science for Seminary side. And that's why, in some ways, both are represented here this morning. I've often thought that neuroscience is a good place to have the conversation, particularly if you're a youth minister, youth pastor, or a pastor. Let's just name it, in a lot of evangelical context, when we get to the science and faith conversation, probably the best word that describes that is awkward, to say the least. But this is a place where health, understanding who we are as human beings, understanding where God is at work in and through, this has just been a very natural point of engagement in how this particular field is helping us to think about the contributions that science can bring back into the conversation of ministry. It's not the only place, but I think this is one place where, for us at NTS, we felt this was a good place to begin in sort of our first steps outward. And in part of our tradition invites that. But I think that's one reason why we took time to show this, is to kind of say, how does this whole conversation around neuroscience and youth ministry just invite a broader conversation? And what happens when science and faith have that conversation together? So I'll stop with that and see if LeeAnn's got anything to add from that standpoint.
I'll just share a little. This is something near and dear to my heart, the integration of science and faith, because I'm a scientist. And I actually, growing up, was never confronted with any conflict. In my home church, it wasn't until I was in graduate school that atheists started saying, well, how do you reconcile all this? And I wasn't willing to give up either my faith or my science at that point. It's like, I will have to do that because I don't want to lose any of those. So I have been on a journey doing that myself, and it looks different at different points. So if you ask me in 2 months where I am with that, it'll probably be a different place than I am now. But at Mount Vernon Nazarene University, I'll talk a little bit about our journey there. So we have undergraduates coming in. About a third of our students are Nazarene. So we have a variety of different students. The vast majority are Christians. So very few that aren't Christians. So we have a Christian population, but what we were finding there is as we started to engage science in the classroom, students shut down. They activate that emotional aspect. It raises an emotional kind of flare to them, and they don't want to engage it, or they didn't want to engage it. They have a feeling, and I'm not sure where this is coming from, but they tend to have a feeling that if they engage intellectually with science and matters of science, it will somehow weaken their faith. And I literally got a call last week from a mother saying, do you know what's being talked about in some of your courses? I'm afraid it's going to weaken my son's faith. And we had to have a long talk about how we see this as a form of worship. We shouldn't shy away from any of this because this is God's creation, so it will reflect God and it will reflect His goodness. And we might not understand it all, but we shouldn't shy away. We should celebrate nature and the natural world. So what we did a few years ago is actually, as a faculty, we devised a science and faith integration course that we've put into our general education. So to really look at the nature of science, so what are the limitations of science, what are the strengths of science, even talk to students about pseudoscience, how to recognize what isn't a good science, so that they're making good personal decisions in terms of the information they're given. But then talk about the same thing in terms of interpretation of Scripture, and then really cover the realm of positions of how scientists reconcile their faith with their science. And so talk about, there's a whole continuum here, and at each place you give up something. You get something and you give up something. And it kind of comes down to what the individual is willing to give up, or where they want to fall in terms of their safety net there. And to really kind of say that this is a personal journey, but to provide an environment that's safe, that's non-threatening, so we can get the person past that emotional response to a place where they can be more reflective and can have a conversation about it. So we talk about this as kingdom building, right? When they go out into the world and they're going to intersect with a lot of different people, they need to be able to have these conversations and not get emotionally very, energized. Be able to just have a discourse with other people from different perspectives. So we don't teach it as an apologetics class, because it's not an indoctrination class in any way. We don't say you're going to be different when you come out. We just say you're going to be more comfortable addressing these things. And again, some of them are more comfortable, but we kind of force them to a place where they can see it as a form of worship more, in terms of being in that state of thinking about science and how it intersects. And so as part of my job, I'm forced to do that in the classroom. I'm tasked with doing that, and it's actually great fun to get, here's the science, now let's think about what that means for us as Christians, and it tends to be very provocative. But,
Great, thank you. So I have potentially 3 questions, but I'm not sure that we have time. So I have a very practical question. I'm looking at you all and what direction you want to go. A very practical question. I have a very kind of common question that we probably maybe all deal with or are worried about. And then I have a really kind of crazy sci-fi question. Where do you want to go? So yeah, see, I've stacked the deck to go to the sci-fi one. All right, so a few months ago, I read this crazy paper I was moderating a panel at another academic conference, and this was an economist from Denmark. And he was writing a paper about artificial intelligence. And what was phenomenal about it is he's an economist, he's writing this, I think that his science was pretty good, but he was also putting it in conversation with the first few chapters of Genesis. And he was making this presumption that at some point we will be able to create the kind of artificial intelligence that will operate. And if you watch golf, they advertise for IBM artificial intelligence all the time. Like, Watson's going to kill us if Terminator's true. One of the things that he was saying is that even right now they have these technologists working in airlocked rooms with computers working on artificial intelligence, fearful that if it gets out onto the internet, then it could be our overlord, and Terminator could be a documentary. But he asked this question, and he kind of puts it in relationship to God of, if we could create such a intelligent being, and we could find out that it could do wrong, would we have it in us to kill it? And then he puts that next to Genesis 2, and it was like mind-blowingly crazy. So my question for you is, Elon Musk told us that one of the biggest things we should fear is not driving a Tesla. Is artificial intelligence. So as neuroscientists, is it possible that the Netflix show Altered Carbon, where they download people's brains and just put them in different body sleeves, could that happen?
Anything is possible, right? I think artificial intelligence is very, very, very much on the radar, both in the business sector, industry, as well as the scientific community, and obviously the public in general, because it spurs a lot of things. The first thought I had was that I think the interesting thing about artificial intelligence and theology is that it spurs our imagination, because I think the desire to create and the desire to do something wondrous is a God-given thing. And the desire to impart what we know onto something else, I think, is a very godly character, right? With that said, the danger of artificial intelligence, or one of the concerns of artificial intelligence, in addition to the more physical thing like self-driving cars and driving safely and things like that, is the idea that because we are flawed, we have our own biases, we have our own perceptions, that we are the ones encoding this artificial intelligence, and so that those biases, unbeknownst to us, will be transferred onto the artificial intelligence system. And that is a big ethical, philosophical question for
So
a lot
it will
of
be
communities.
created sinful.
I don't think science would call it sinful, but I think there are some concerns about that, and there's a lot of panels and conversations happening, which I think, I will say that the scientific community is asking a lot of theologians and community leaders to come forward and to contribute to that. But I like to also say that, I like to harp back on what we said before, which is the idea that humans are resilient and that we create these tools for us. And so I like to, instead of all doom and gloom, I like to say that hopefully it'll create new jobs, hopefully it'll create new skill sets and make life easier for us in many ways. And it also harks back into the question of human identity, because you said, can we download kind of like Matrix, the movie or something? I've just aged myself. But the idea that if we change one neuron at a time, how much? The question of endowing God's spirit in us, what is that? Right? And designed in God's image, Imago Dei, those kind of things. I mean, those are really questions, I think, for you guys.
Well, I mean, but as a
quick exit
though,
there.
I mean, maybe Dean said this, but I think you both nodded your head, is that the whole idea, like the Matrix in some sense, that you could have a brain in a vat. And I know really Neo is just a battery, but that you could have a brain in a vat doesn't necessarily work that way. So how does that go with artificial intelligence? Could you have a brain just on a hard drive?
It doesn't. I mean, we are completely embodied individuals. So within our entire body, not just within the brain, and within our community, right? So we're larger than just our bodies as well. And how I think about artificial intelligence, obviously with artificial intelligence, you have the potential to have endless knowledge and really endless potential, which we don't have within our natural systems. And I've really reflected on, because I'm in awe of the brain, and it's spectacular in its design. And so it does beg the question, why did God design us with limitations? And the thing I came up with was because then we need each other, right? If I don't know everything, I need to reach out to you guys and to help me to learn new things. And so it forces a need for others. Whereas I think if we get a Watson who is completely all-knowing, it's going to be in isolation, so it won't be anything like our current situation. And yeah, I think that the other one is the relation with God aspect. I don't know how that would look, I guess. So yeah, we'll put it back on you guys.
Maybe this is where the science and the theologians come together. I mean, it would be interesting to see as things develop. Could you get a Turing test that could pass for poetry, could actually do art? I mean, you'll be able to get...
Or is Turing test the right test?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the caliber right now, but is it really?
Yeah. And you know what the Turing test is? This is like in computer lingo of getting a machine where when you interact with it, you assume it's another person. Then it's passed the Turing test. So if you've ever been catfished by a caller on the phone that says hello, in some sense that has passed the Turing test. For at least 2 seconds, you thought it was a real person.
Yeah. Two things. One, very quickly, only you would come back with the science fiction thing. So just a shout out to the group. If you don't know, Andy has this little book about science and youth ministry that starts out with exploding stars, dead dinosaurs, and zombies. So now we're into AI as yet the fourth piece. I will go ahead and say to you, I recommend that book on science and youth ministry, because it's less about mastering the science as it is understanding what ministry looks like in the midst of all that. Now, having said that, I think this idea of embodied cognition, again, who we are as beings is deeply connected to the created world and to each other. And can AI approximate that? I think is a question that hasn't been answered yet. And particularly the fact because experiences change us. So what makes us human may not be necessarily what's working in the brain in a given moment when something's programmed, but what is it about the way in which experience and our relationships to others really change us and make us even more human? And I think that's a deep theological question in light of our relationship to God and relationship to the created order. The other side of it is I think the AI kind of picks up into a bad, and I'll just use this language, theological anthropology, big term, where we've tended to separate out mind and body and soul in ways in which they're kind of hermeneutically sealed inside their own containers. And I think both in theology proper and also in neuroscience, we're learning those categories don't work. And that in some sense, a guy I like, Warren Brown, talks about our soulishness, that our very relatedness to God embodies the totality, sort of an Old Testament understanding of who we are, less Greek, more Hebrew. And that will always be, I think, at least where the awkward side of theology responding back to AI is going to go, maybe someday, maybe. But I think, when you look at the absolute complexity of the brain, what that would look like is really, not just the brain and the number of neurons or the whole trillions of cells that comprise any one brain, but the multiplicity of relationship and experience. Could that all ever be repeated in a program? I'm not sure.
Okay, we have 1 minute, and so this is the speed round, and it's a question just to the two of you, and this will conclude, and then I'll pass this over to Mike, which is that you both ended up in the sciences, and if biology is true, you were young people at some point. So if you were in one of these people's youth ministry, and you're back to being 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, what do you need? What would you want your youth director, youth pastor to say to you? And you each have 30 seconds.
I think I just want to reinforce the thought that the culture, as we talked about, and the environment is very important. And I was blessed, and I showed that picture. I was blessed to be growing up in an environment where my parents cultivated that. Look at the mountains. Look at this fly. Look at this flower. And to see where the youth or the children are and where their interests are, and see where their calling is, and to encourage that. It may be science, but it may not. And to cultivate that, I would say that would be my take home.
I grew up, again, I'm flashing back. I grew up very fortunately in a very small congregation. And individuals invested in me personally. And again, if I showed up there this Sunday, they would be ecstatic to see me. And I know that because of how much they invested. And I think in the way they invested was with the confidence of, you can do whatever you want. There's no limitations, and helping me discern what my motives should be in picking paths. And so to kind of pull me away from, don't pick a profession because you're going to make a lot of money. Pick something that is your calling, that's something you're passionate about. And obviously I ended up at higher ed, so I took that.
Let's give them a hand. Mike.